Well, hello again. Chapter 2. Thank you so much for the reaction that I had on social media. So I thought I'd carry on. I won't go through the explanation of what all this is about because you'll have to watch the first part. I also need a haircut and a beard. And if you're watching this in the future, this is when we're in lockdown because of the coronavirus. So I've got an excuse. Okay, so last time we talked about the very first Maverick Theatre production, a one-man version of Shakespeare's Henry V. Thanks to the man who did the sound on Kenneth Branagh's film version of Shakespeare's Henry V, I had my sound effect. So here is part 2. So, thanks to Campbell Askew's kindness, I had the major sound effect. I just said that. Anyway. However, I still had no set to play the effects on. I didn't know any theatre set designers or indeed any idea where to find one, especially given our budget. We were all on a pint each. My salvation arrived in the shape of my girlfriend's dad. John Raybone drove a black taxi cab, but in a previous life he'd worked designing household appliances for a company in Birmingham. I mentioned I wanted the motif of the wooden stakes planted in the ground before the Battle of Agincourt, and he created, initially on paper, a section of wooden poles tied together with rough rope. It looked good, although I also wanted the stakes to fall forward on the stage into an attack position during the action of the play. But even though John came up with a great mechanism for making it work, it was one more thing for poor actor Rob to cope with. I was also more than a little concerned that if the system failed, I might have an impaled King of England. I had a happy time at Amdram and considered doing the show there at Hall Green Little Theatre in Birmingham. But I also wanted to bring it to a wider audience, so Hall Green Little Theatre kindly allowed me to preview the show in their main house, and then I phoned up the MAC, the Midlands Arts Centre in Birmingham, to see if we could do the main show there. The MAC was a great venue, started by arts lovers of Birmingham back in the can-do 1960s. It's situated in Cannon Hill Park, opposite the Edgbaston Cricket Ground, and remains one of the jewels in the Midlands Arts crown. They had 2 spaces and agreed to let me rent their smaller space for 3 nights for £50 a night, including a technician. Done. Then Roy Palmer from Hall Green Little Theatre offered to help with the get-in too. Brilliant. Then I had the first of many crises of confidence. What if my adaptation of one of Shakespeare's greatest plays, Henry V, was pants? I knew the team were greatly talented, but I was writing and directing and producing. What if nobody liked it? What if nobody turned up? And I was playing with the master, not too shabby as old Shakespeare. Lodger and chum Keith came to the rescue. He'd long wanted to direct John Godber's Teachers comedy and had a talented team of actors in mind, including Glenn Bays, who was teaching at sixth form, and my partner, Rebecca, who'd been accepted for 2 drama schools and was leaving for London in April to start with the Easter intake of the Webber Douglas Academy. That felt better. We'd sandwich Henry between 2 nights of Teachers. Then if Henry fell apart, at least we'd have the genius of John Godber to soften the blow. I needn't have worried. I was too scared to invite the press to the MAC, but we had a packed house. I actually had to give up my seat. I was so nervous, I can't remember much about it, to be honest. I cringed at every little mistake, but I've never ever been satisfied with my productions. And in 80 minutes of non-stop action, I'd inadvertently created a show with over 120 technical cues, all time critical and level sensitive. There were explosions, smoke, radio mics and soundtracks to balance. And I think the technical team were as knackered as actor Rob was, acting his heart out on the tiny Hexagon Theatre stage. And then came the after-show blur. I was aware at the end of the show that most of the people had stood up, desperate to get out, I assumed. It took me a moment to realise what was going on. No, it was a standing ovation. What? My first ever production and a standing ovation. Rob did a number of curtain calls. There were no curtains, of course, the theatre was too tiny for that. And then there were friends and people hugging me and shaking hands. Ron Edwards, who I'd known all my life and was the sartorial son of my mum's best friend from our estate in King's Heath in Birmingham, came over. "Do you know," said Ron, "I sat near the back so I could nip out for cigarettes because I had no idea about Shakespeare." But I didn't nip out. It was gripping, Nicholas, gripping. He's one of very few people who constantly uses my full name. And Brian Norton, long-time friend from the Sea Scouts, our council estate equivalent of an old boys club, clapped me on the back at the end and saying, Not bad, Nick, not bad at all. Fancy a pint? And Andy Bloom, current quiet van driver who was soon to realise his potential and start writing and making films, giving me a small smirk and a nod of the head and a thumbs up from the back of the bar. And Trish, Rob's girlfriend, smiling and saying, "You did it, you did it." And then, like something out of a film, a stranger approaches me and taps me on the shoulder and says, "That was really rather good. Would you mind if we took you to the Edinburgh Festival this summer? Obviously we'll pay for everything." And so it all began. Edinburgh was a huge experience that led me to establish Maverick. I'd never been to the festival before and had no idea what it would be like, but I loved the artistic and creative madness, the blind optimism, democracy and sheer exhausting pace of it all. And I wanted to recreate that vibe in Birmingham, Britain's second city. It sounds a bit naff, but in a way, Edinburgh gave me the gift of theatre. I realised I wasn't the only freak in the world that wanted to make theatre and scratch that creative itch that had frustrated me for so long. And when the newspapers finally turned up, it was even more flattering. Henry V, Lion of England, had universal critical acclaim at the biggest arts festival in the world, Edinburgh. I got used to reviewers calling it a tour de force, and a reviewer from one of the Oxbridge student newspapers telling me I'd probably be very famous when I'm dead. Can't remember why. The company that took us to Edinburgh were called Starward, and they were then the managers of Jasper Carrott and Phil Cool. We were to play all 3 weeks of the festival. They booked a magnificent flat for us overlooking the meadows in Edinburgh. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle used to live in the flat below us. There were 3 of us in a 5-bedroom apartment and we had our own snooker table. I assumed that every theatre company that went to the Edinburgh Festival Fringe had similar accommodation. I was also disappointed we were only attracting audiences of 20 or 30 in our venue at Marco's. How wrong I was. It turns out the average audience on the Festival Fringe is, wait for it, 3. So we did good. I also realised that not all companies had the level of luxury we had. We met one particular theatre company that were actually sleeping on the dirt floor of a barn some 15 miles away. They would beg us to allow them just to sleep on the floor at our flat. We had carpet, you see. Edinburgh was a blast, but it was very hard work. It was the first time I started to drift into theatre producing. Starwood had a number of acts in Edinburgh, one of whom, incredibly, was managed by another boy from the Scouts gang show at Birmingham Hippodrome back in the day. Ian Richards was then manager of the Hank Wangford Band. Great. What a small world. But because Starwood was stretched, I found myself feeling obliged to help with the business side of things. So I would cycle up to the local phone box with a bag of change and try and phone the press and listings people to try and shiver them along to help out Starwood. Brackets. Having just written that, how old school does that sound? Cycling to a phone box with change for the phone. It was only 1992. No mobiles, no internet, close brackets. Edinburgh was a unique experience. But actor Rob Vomit found the pressure of playing Henry and 12 other characters a lot, and soon after Edinburgh he went off to do other actor things. We were a good first team, I think, and I felt sad I couldn't keep him involved any longer. On reflection, perhaps I wasn't supportive enough, although he never mentioned anything, and of course I had no idea what producers did and didn't. I didn't feel I had any particular role to fulfil. Rob was not just an actor, he was a mate. I'd first got to know Rob Vomit through Amdram before he went to drama school. He invited me to a party at his house through a friend, and we turned up, rang the front doorbell. Rob answered. The party had been going on for some time. "Hi," he said, full of bon ami. "I'm Rob." And then he threw up. Hence the name Rob Vomit. A good and talented man. Sometime after Edinburgh, we had an approach from a producer in Los Angeles about being the centrepiece of a semi-Shakespeare festival in LA. And I got very excited about that. But I got an agent by then, a new agent, and they couldn't see the deal, or seal the deal, and it fell apart. I'd have actually walked to Los Angeles and in typical Maverick style see what happened, but it wasn't to be. It was my first experience of not liking doing the proper thing. I met the producer, Jerry, a year or so later. I was red-faced and apologetic, but he was very gracious and understanding. He knew how agents worked. He had his revenge by explaining how he got an idea for a whole Shakespeare-themed experience based around my Henry V Lion of England. Sounded great. It had fallen apart for about £1,000 apparently, and the agent who blown the deal was sacked from my agency a short time later. Hey-ho, such is life. After the Edinburgh Festival, we decided we'd need a name if we were to form a theatre company and keep things going, which seemed like the thing to do, especially being so inspired by the Edinburgh Festival and wanted to do it in Birmingham. So far, we've been using Keith's school company moniker, Rear Window Theatre, which was okay, but if we were going to run a professional company, we need a separate identity. Rob Williams and I pondered. Birmingham Stage Company? Brumcom? No. Pre-internet, eventually we decided we didn't want anything geographically specific or even artistically specific so that we could do other things. Eventually we settled on a term that we'd used a lot to describe my Henry V and what we wanted to do with my post-Amdram ambitions. It was a term we used a lot when we were chatting. We often talked about taking theatre and doing something maverick with it. I went to the library, how quaint pre-internet, and found the name wasn't being used much, so Maverick Theatre it was. Within a year or so, a film had come out with the same name, and the biggest recording star in the world, Madonna, and an innovative TV company in Birmingham were all mavericks. But that was okay, and we were there first. Flushed with enthusiasm, I approached the arch bodies in Birmingham and the West Midlands about creating a new theatre fringe for the city. It would be dynamic, it would provide opportunities for local artists, it would reflect what it meant to be a Brummie. It would build a whole new audience at our new informal venues. It would start with contemporary classics and then move to new works. It would be brilliant. It would be largely ignored by the arts bodies. Chapter 3, don't put your daughter on the stage. I don't think the arts bodies were against us, the arts funding bodies that is. I just don't think we, or at least I, put across our case well enough. Although it exposed a still current failing of the arts funding system, in my humble opinion. The arts organisations that get the funding have to be good at applying for funding. Of course, it's not that simple, and artistic integrity and track record is also important. And without blowing our trumpet, Maverick's philosophy was pretty unique, and none of us really had an idea. We weren't theatre people. But the arts bodies almost unanimously were hostile to my plans, even though most of the individuals involved, I have to say, were lovely. And again, this was 1992. The Conservative Party were still in power, and nobody had ever heard of the term social inclusion. So it's hard to be too harsh. Although the expert Birmingham City Council employed to look at the notion of a pub theatre company was a bit of a twat. Sorry, I don't even know his name, but his level of expertise with our first experiment in the Billesley pub in Birmingham, John Godber's teachers, was to tell me, I don't like Godber anyway, as he flounced out the door. I was tempted to tell him that he was not really our target audience, but I was already basking in our first success. Having been told by the experts that nobody would come to the Billesley pub and that, quote, the people of Birmingham are not ready for pub theatre, unquote, whatever that means, we'd prodded on, anyway, with rehearsals, and I thought we should just do it and then scuttle away afterwards. Although we had an almost non-existent budget to get a complicated message across, I worked quite hard on publicity, and as part of the Maverick proposition, we'd advertised in areas not traditionally used by proper theatres. But I also wanted a turn up and pay on the night philosophy. I didn't really want audiences to get wrapped up in the traditional theatre box office formalities. Maverick was commando theatre. Theatre in a local pub. Turn up, get a pint, have a fag and a pie, and have a laugh watching a play. No drama, apart from what's happening live in front of you. But my philosophy meant we had no advanced box office, so an hour or so before the show we had no official ticket sales. With the experts saying it wouldn't work, it was with a vaguely heavy heart on our very first night, and the first ever night of theatre at the Billesley pub in Kingsheath, Birmingham, I spread 12 chairs and tables around the room to try and make it look fuller. I knew I'd invited 12 people, so that would be okay, even if there was something of a dropout. Then at 7 p.m, some people turned up and I didn't recognise them. I suddenly realised the cast must have a few friends and family coming too. There were 3 in the cast. I'd tactfully stayed away from talking about audience numbers with them. I was expecting us to be playing for 2 or 3 people, perhaps, on at least one of our nights, so I'd cheerfully spoken to the cast about how our spirit would be good even if we only had 1 audience member. I needn't have worried. At 7:10, all the seats were taken and we had to grab more chairs from next door. By 7:20, all the tables had to be taken out of the room to allow for more chairs. We were due to start at 7:30, but we still had a queue of people down the stairs. Steve Kemp, a mate of mine who worked at a plastics factory, had agreed to do the door. He'd had a £5 float. Change! I need more change! And he waved a £20 note at me. 20 quid? Where'd that come from? The show eventually started nearly 3/4 of an hour late, but we nearly covered all our costs for the run on that first night. I was mightily relieved. After the show, Mick from the Arts Council came up to me. You papered the house, didn't you? He asked with a wry smile. Papering the house is a theatre term for giving away free tickets to make the venue look full. I tried not to crow. Mick was one of the people who'd said we wouldn't get any audience, although in fairness he'd tried a comedy night with Birmingham Repertory Theatre at the Billsley pub and it had failed miserably. There were 3 pairs of complimentary tickets, I said. 6 free tickets in all. And you had 2 of them. I tried not to look too smug. Chapter 4, Intro 4, Onwards and Upwards. After the I need to take a small break. How are we doing for time? After the success of Teachers, I felt I'd proved there was an appetite for our kind of theatre on the estates of South Birmingham, particularly if we could programme the right sort of work and make the whole event an experience, an event. We had to eventually introduce a box office system of a sort because we ended up selling out and it was becoming something of a scrum for our audiences, and there was a pressure to get there early and get their best seats, which is something I certainly didn't want. In spite of the audience success and critical acclaim in the press, the economies never really added up though. We scraped along. The actors got better deals, but part of the concept included really affordable tickets, lots of concessions, and often freebies for those really in need. The funding bodies didn't help much, but then we didn't really meet any of their criteria. And this was the end of Thatcherism and a Conservative government. They started the National Lottery, but that mainly depended on matching funding, which was okay for the funding companies, but no good for little us. They hadn't done too much else for the arts, and funding was ridiculously tight. Mick Yates became a mate and would occasionally buy me a curry or a beer. He eventually went back to writing. He always had the soul of a poet. Access and social inclusion became more of a priority, but fundamentally we were products of a working class council estate, or at least I was, and all the people that were helping me were, more or less. On reflection, we really needed an arts graduate or an administrator who knew the correct funding speak. In fact, we still do. Get in touch. The concept developed a space, and Ansell's, the brewery, helped us immensely by providing support in kind. They didn't give us any cash, but they would do things like make a banner for outside the pub that allowed us to, and they would allow us to use their photocopying print room, which was a massive help for the first year or so. They finally stopped their support when they became Allied Domecq. Allied Domecq decided instead to give all their help in future to the Royal Shakespeare Company down the road in Stratford. The irony. On reflection, I think we did a lot with a little over the Billsley years. Rob's brother, Nigel Williams, came up with a very good business plan that showed how a brewery or a pub group would make a handsome return in 3 years if they supported us up front. But again, our resources were limited, and while we were making theatre, Nigel was struggling to start his own new business. And we had success with Sir Derek Jacobi, my play Pals, and some great actors and directors who worked for the belief in what we were doing. There were lots of ups and downs there too. But maybe that is a story for another time. Intro 5. So, to celebrate that time, like a time capsule, here is the stream of consciousness that I wrote in 1997. I'll let me introduce it, and I'll do it in part 3. Please let me know the commenting. I think you do comments down below. Please let me know if I'm just wasting my time, if I'm boring you to death, if there's any benefit in this, or if you're ever in London, which is where we are at the moment, you want to buy me a pint. Cheers.